If only I knew then what I know now. I wanted to take the time to share some of the mistakes that I made in my early 20s in the hopes of inspiring other people not to make the same mistakes and to move smarter with their money. Hindsight is always 20/20, but I hope that what I share with you today will be helpful in allowing you to make better financial decisions with your money. The first money mistake I made in my early 20s was merely surviving or living paycheck to paycheck. I do want to make a video on money trauma sometime soon, but basically I wanted to describe here that because I grew up pretty low income, we didn't have enough money to cover the things that we needed to cover. As a result, I developed a kind of fear that whatever little money did come into my possession, I became afraid that I would lose it, and so immediately I would spend it, and that was sort of the way that I behaved for a good number of years until I eventually caught on that it was behavior that I needed to interrupt, because while it may have served me at some point in my life, it no longer was serving me and was causing me harm and was causing me to handle my money in a way that wasn't efficient, in a way that wasn't going to bring me success. And so eventually I was able to kind of snap out of it and realize that I needed to change my behavior. Now, this first mistake, I'll admit, is a bit loaded, as it can involve coming to terms with the way that you were raised, the sort of money issues or stories that you were told growing up, seeing the way that your parents handled money or the things that they lectured to you about money, or whether money was discussed at all in your household. But more than anything, I want to stress becoming aware of the way that you're using your money, your behavior patterns around money, and living below your means. There's the possibility that you might learn that you don't actually make enough to cover the things that you need to cover. That's another conversation, but at that point in time, you realize that you need to find a job or a second source of income to ensure that you have the money to cover all of the expenses that you need to cover, and also to cover some of the things that you want, right? Because what is life if you're just spending it on the things that you absolutely need, like your housing and your food, and then you have nothing left over to enjoy yourself? That's not a balanced life. And so, if this is the conclusion that you draw from realizing that you don't have enough money on a monthly basis to cover the things that you need and the things that you want, and for savings as well, then it's time for a reevaluation. But in describing tip number 1, I merely wanted to point out that we shouldn't just merely be surviving. We should be able to be okay if per se a paycheck didn't come. It's not like the end of the world and the rug is just going to be pulled from under you. If that's the case, you really need to build up your savings so that one paycheck that doesn't arrive just shatters your world. That's not the way that you should be living. Moving on to money mistake number 2, I didn't have an emergency fund. I'm going to be real transparent here. It's kind of embarrassing, but I didn't even know about having an emergency fund. It wasn't until I believe I read The Total Money Makeover that I realized the importance of having one, and he stresses having one that's a minimum of $1,000. But after doing my research and stuff, I learned that ideally you should have an emergency fund of 3 to 6 months living expenses. Some people even have 12 months living expenses, but most of the sources that I read mentioned 3 to 6 months living expenses. And in my early 20s, I had nothing saved. Everything would just be living day to day, and that was definitely one of my biggest struggles as a young 20-something. And so I stress to you the importance of having an emergency fund. As you might guess, when you don't have an emergency fund and you have credit cards become your emergency fund, and then you rack up a bill for things that you've put on these cards. And mind you that most credit cards have an interest rate that ranges from 16 up to like 24%. I think some cards might be slightly lower, slightly higher. That's a large percentage for an interest rate. That's a lot that you're paying simply to borrow the money that you borrowed to cover whatever emergency expenses came up. To avoid all of that, having an emergency fund is key. Moving on to money mistake number 3, emotional spending. When I started examining the way that I would spend my money, I soon learned that there was a pattern. Whenever I would feel sad, I would usually resort to food or to going shopping. Obviously, both of these things are problematic if I'm doing them to manage my feelings. not only do my expenses then get out of control because they are based on the emotion that I feel that day, but it's also not very good for my bank account balance. And as you can imagine, this was a downward spiral because while I was feeling sad about one thing, eventually I would rack up a bill and then I would be sad about that thing too. And so then maybe I would spend again, and it was just this vicious, cyclical cycle, if that makes sense, of this really bad behavior. And so I needed to become aware of it first in order to stop doing it, and then obviously learn to cope in healthier ways. So an example of coping in a healthier way could be, I feel sad for X reason, and instead of going out to buy myself an ice cream or taking a trip to the mall, maybe instead I'll decide, you know what, let me put on some lo-fi music and just take the next 30 minutes to journal about the reason that I'm feeling sad. And in that way, I'm not incurring any unnecessary charges to any credit cards, I'm managing my feelings in a healthier way, and I'm not losing here and putting myself into a vicious cycle of bad money behavior. If you do engage in emotional spending, it's definitely something that you want to get a handle on as soon as you possibly can. Moving on to the fourth financial mistake that I made, not setting financial goals. As I mentioned earlier, I was often caught up in the day-to-day expenses of my life. I wasn't really thinking about my long-term goals and that I should have been creating a plan to reach those goals. For example, for the longest time, I wanted to buy my mother a house. I've known that I wanted to do that for a very long time, and while that's true, and I think that, it's a good thing to want, I've never really put a plan as to how I was going to accomplish that. I just knew that, when I turned 18, I needed to go to college, and eventually college would get me a good enough paying job so that I could save money for a down payment and then negotiate a solid mortgage rate. I didn't actually know about negotiating mortgages right then, but I knew that I needed to get a good job to make good money to be able to afford this house that I wanted. However, in the process of being in college and the years thereafter, I wasn't putting money into a savings account for this down payment. I was just living in the day-to-day. And realistically, I wasn't really making much money being a tutor in college or waiting the tables that I was waiting, but I wasn't saving anything. And so I'm very grateful that I've come around to the importance of saving in order to reach the financial goals that I've set for myself. To clarify, so I said this was not setting financial goals, but it's really more so about delaying gratification. I guess a combination of both. First, what is it that you want money to afford you? And second, what will you do today to get closer to that thing that you want in the future? And so I want to propose not getting caught up in the day-to-day, but also introducing delayed gratification and thinking about how you'll reach the goals that you've set yourself to accomplish later on in your life by doing things today. And the last tip that I have for y'all, tip number 5, is not educating myself on personal finance. I'm not really sure what I was thinking or if I was thinking about this at all, but I think a part of me sort of expected that other people or systems like school would eventually teach me about these important topics. Topics like investing and saving and interest rates and mortgages and negotiation and all of those very important life-changing topics, and school never really got around to it. And neither did my parents, unfortunately. Being first gen, I totally understand that there was so much already that my parents needed to learn to navigate to create a life for themselves here in the US. And so there were some things that they didn't learn themselves from their parents or their schooling systems. And so I wish I would have realized sooner that no one was going to teach me this and I needed to learn it on my own. I wish I sort of would have been woken up to it sooner. But hey, like they say, it would have been great to start 10 years ago, but you know what? The second best time to start is now. And so now that we're aware of some of the money mistakes that young 20-year-olds make, like the ones that I shared with you today, I hope that you'll take this information and find ways to better handle your own money. Because you should know that unfortunately money isn't just numbers, it isn't strictly logical. If anything, I would say that money is very emotional in that it is strongly tied to human behavior. And while some of us may think that the way we behave is strictly logical, that's not true. And so becoming aware of the way that we behave, the way we handle our money, that awareness will help us cultivate smarter ways of managing our money. If y'all found any of this information helpful, please like and subscribe, as it helps me know that this information is helpful and motivates me to continue making content like this. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see y'all in the next one.